Welcome to Her Subconscious Blueprint, your no BS space for subconscious healing, bold breakthroughs, and becoming the woman who actually lives the life she dreams about. I'm Jen Boyd, hypnotherapist, mindset coach, and your new healing hype girl. And before I say anything else today, I want to acknowledge something. This episode is very vulnerable for me. Not because I'm afraid of telling the truth, but because this is the kind of truth that doesn't fit into simple narratives. There's no villain here. There's no dramatic betrayal. There's no moment where everything suddenly exploded. This is the kind of ending that happens quietly. The kind that happens when two people love each other deeply and still have to admit that what they're living inside is no longer aligned. Today, I want to talk about my marriage, about my relationship, about the decision to end something that mattered. Not because we didn't love each other, but because we did. And I want to talk about this in a way that honors both of us, because this story isn't about blame. It's about honesty. For a long time, I believed that if love was real, it should be enough. That if two people cared deeply, they should be able to make it work. That commitment meant enduring, adjusting, trying harder, staying longer. And for a long time, we did. We tried in ways we knew how. We showed up in the ways we were capable of at the time. We loved each other the best we could with the tools we had. And that matters. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly. Quietly. We started growing in different directions, not better or worse, just different. And instead of supporting that growth, the relationship started making it easier to not change. That's a hard thing to admit. Because from the outside, things can look fine, functional, stable, even loving. But growth doesn't always ask if something is working. It asks if something is alive. And there came a point where we had to face a truth neither of us wanted to rush towards. The current relationship, the way it existed, it was over. Not because of lack of love, not because one of us failed, but because staying in it was keeping us comfortable in ways that were no longer honest. We weren't challenging each other anymore. We weren't expanding together. We weren't becoming more of ourselves inside that dynamic. And comfort without growth slowly turns into stagnation. The realization was heartbreaking because loving someone doesn't make the truth easier to accept. It actually makes it harder. We had to look at each other and admit that if there was ever going to be any kind of future, any kind of real conscious relationship, this version of us had to end. Not pause, not adjust, but end. And that takes courage. It takes courage to say, I love you and I can't keep doing it this way, the way that we are. It takes courage to choose honesty over familiarity. It takes courage to step into uncertainty when staying would be easier. We didn't do this because we don't care. Quite the opposite. We did this because we do care deeply. Because love that is rooted in truth, it doesn't cling to comfort at the expense of growth. And one of the hardest parts of this process was realizing that being together was actually making it easier for both of us to avoid the changes that we needed to make individually. We were holding each other in place, not intentionally, not maliciously, but gently, subtle, unconsciously. And sometimes love does that. Sometimes love cushions you so well that you stop pushing into your own becoming. And choosing to step away from that, choosing to create space, was not about running from love. It was about honoring it. Because if we were ever going to relate again in any way that was conscious, it could not be built on the same foundation. That foundation had already been done. It had done what it was meant to do. And that's the part that hurts and heals at the same time. Outgrowing a relationship is one of the most confusing experiences that there is, because it doesn't come with a clear emotional script. There's no obvious moment where you can point and say, this is where it broke. There's no single event that makes everything make sense. There's no clean place to put the grief. You're still laughing sometimes. You still care. You still see the good in each other, and you still love deeply. And that's what makes it so painful and so hard. Because how do you grieve something that wasn't toxic? It wasn't cruel. It wasn't wrong. It just no longer aligned. For a long time, I tried to bypass the grief by telling myself that growth was good, that honesty was necessary, that this was the mature choice. And all of that is true. But it doesn't take away the ache. There's a very special kind of grief that comes with letting go of a relationship you believed would grow with you. A grief for the future that you imagined, the moments you thought would happen, the version of love you hoped would evolve instead of end. And I had to let myself feel that without turning it into blame. Because blame is seductive when you're hurting. It gives us something to hold on to. It gives us a reason. But this wasn't about someone being wrong. This was about two people becoming more of themselves and realizing that the relationship as it was could not hold that growth. The truth is hard to sit with because it means you don't get to be the victim. It means you don't get to rewrite history to protect your heart. It means you have to hold love and loss at the same time. There were moments where I wish something dramatic would happen just so the ending would make more sense, just so the pain would have a clear explanation. But real endings are rarely that neat. Some of the time, they arrive as quiet knowing that you can't ignore anymore. A sense that staying would require you to keep dimming parts of yourself. A sense that you're choosing comfort over truth. A sense that you're no longer becoming inside the relationship. And when that knowing arrives, you can't unknow it. What made this decision especially tender is that we didn't arrive at it alone. We had to look at each other honestly. We had to say things that were uncomfortable but necessary. We had to admit that the dynamics we were in wasn't helping either of us change. That being together was making it easier to stay the same. And that's not failure. That's awareness. Sometimes relationships end not because they were wrong, but because they did what they were meant to do. They taught you how to love. They showed you parts of yourself you hadn't seen before. They gave you safety when you needed it. And then they ask you to grow beyond them. That doesn't mean the love wasn't real. It means it was seasonal. One of the hardest parts of this process was letting go of the idea that separation meant rejection. It doesn't. Separation can be an act of respect. Respect for the truth. Respect for each other's growth. Respect for the fact that forcing something to continue when it's complete, it only creates resentment. And resentment is far more damaging to love than space ever could be. Choosing space was not choosing distance from love. It was choosing honesty over habit. And we had to acknowledge that if there was ever going to be any kind of relationship again, romantic or otherwise, it could not be built on the same patterns, the same roles, the same foundation, and the same unspoken expectations. Those patterns had already taken us as far as they could go. To build anything new, the old foundation had to end. The cycles had to break. And the realization came with deep sadness and deep relief. Relief in not having to pretend anymore. Relief in not having to force connection. Relief in knowing that choosing ourselves didn't require destroying each other. I want to say this clearly, especially for anyone listening who might be in a similar space. Choosing to step away from a relationship doesn't mean you failed at love. Sometimes it means you succeeded at truth. And truth is the only place that real love can exist. One of the hardest truths we had to face was this. If we stayed in the same place, in the same dynamic, nothing would actually change. We could talk about growth. We could name intentions. We could promise to try harder and try differently. But without the space, those promises would stay theoretical. because when you remain inside the same container, the nervous system defaults to the same patterns. Comfort takes over. Familiar roles resurface. Old ways of relating quietly slip back into place. And we both knew that if we were truly serious about growth, real growth, not conceptual growth, we had to do it separately. And this wasn't to punish each other, not to create distance out of fear, but to remove the safety net that made it easy not to change. This was one of the most confronting realizations of all. Because love often wants to soften the edges. It wants to protect. It wants to cushion the fall. But growth doesn't always come from cushioning. Sometimes growth comes from standing on your own 2 feet and asking yourself the hard questions without someone else buffering the answers. We weren't helping each other anymore. We were holding each other back and holding each other in places that were no longer aligned. And the realization required a level of self-responsibility that was uncomfortable for both of us. It meant acknowledging that staying together was allowing patterns to continue that no longer served either one of us. The relationship had become familiar enough that it didn't demand evolution. And choosing to step away meant choosing to face ourselves without distractions. And that is so fucking scary. Because when you remove the relationship, you're left with yourself, your habits, your wounds, your unmet needs, your coping mechanisms. There's no one there to protect you or to project onto. No one to lean on in the same way. No one to blame for stagnation. The level of honesty can feel like free falling. But it's also where real growth begins. Being in our own space created room for reflection that simply wasn't possible before. It allowed us to notice how we showed up when no one was cushioning us. The silence was clarity. How we regulate ourselves, how we respond to discomfort without immediately reaching for familiarity. It asks each one of us to take responsibility for our own healing, not to fix ourselves for the other person, not to become better to earn love, but to become more for ourselves. And that is an important distinction. Growth done to preserve a relationship, it often comes from fear. Growth done for yourself, it comes from truth. We didn't separate to guarantee an outcome. We separated because the outcome couldn't be the goal anymore. The process had to be. That's one of the hardest things to sit with. Not knowing what the future holds, not knowing whether paths will cross again in the same way, not knowing what form of love might take next. But clinging to certainty would have required dishonesty. And we weren't willing to do that anymore. I think one of the most painful myths we're taught about love is that if it's real, it should always look the same. That commitment means continuity at all cost. That change equals failure. That endings negate everything that came before. But love isn't static. It evolves or it suffocates. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to allow someone to end so it doesn't decay into resentment, obligation, or quiet despair. Choosing to step into our own growth separately was not a rejection. It's what we shared. It was honoring it. Because love that's real doesn't demand that you stay in the same. It wants you to become more fully for yourself. Even if that path is uncertain. And the uncertainty is where trust is built. Trust in yourself. Trust in your capacity to stand alone. Trust in the idea that what's meant to come back will, and what doesn't was never meant to stay. This has been one of the most humbling, grounding experiences of my life because it stripped away illusion. It showed me where I had been compromising my own growth in the name of comfort, where I had been staying quiet to keep the peace, where I had been choosing familiarity over expansion, and it asked me to choose myself without churning love into an enemy. That's not an easy line to walk, but it is an honest one. And honesty is the only place healing can actually happen. As I sit with everything I've shared today, the thing that keeps coming back to me is this. Love doesn't disappear just because a relationship changed forms. Love doesn't vanish when you choose honesty. Love doesn't end when you choose growth. Love doesn't become meaningless because it can't stay the same. Sometimes love evolves by asking for space. And that's one of the hardest truths to accept, especially in a world that tells us that love should always look like staying, holding on, pushing through, and enduring. But endurance isn't the same as devotion. Devotion to love sometimes requires choosing integrity over familiarity. Devotion to growth sometimes requires endings that don't come with guarantees. You can care deeply without clinging. You can release without resentment. You can choose yourself without erasing what you shared. And if you're listening to this and finding pieces of your own story in it, I want you to know that you're not alone and that you're not broken for questioning it. You're not disloyal for wanting more alignment, and you're not failing because something no longer fits the way it once did. Sometimes relationships don't end because something went wrong. They end because something finished. And completion is not failure. It's fulfillment. This season of my life is asking me to stand in my own truth, to continue becoming without guarantees, to trust that whatever form love takes next, whether together or apart, it must be built on honesty, growth, and self-respect and responsibility. And that feels both terrifying and freeing. But I do know this much. I would rather walk forward uncertain and aligned than stay somewhere familiar and untrue. And if you're standing at a similar crossroad, I hope this episode gives you permission not to rush, not to decide, not to blow your life up, but to listen. To listen to what's alive in you. To listen to what's asking for space. To listen to the truth you've been quietly carrying. You don't need to villainize anyone to choose different. You don't need to justify your growth. You don't need to know how the story ends to honor who you are now. Sometimes the bravest thing you can say is, this version of me is complete. And then just let yourself grieve. Let yourself soften and let yourself grow. I am so full of love and gratitude that I get to share my story with you. This is her subconscious blueprint, where we don't just chase our dreams, we become them. And remember, you don't get what you want, you get who you are. So go out and be that version of her today. Much love and gratitude. I will see you next time.